All right, well, thank you for not taking a nap and for those of you who stuck around. Today, I'll be talking about some of the barriers, breakthroughs, and the path forward in clinical trials. And I'll talk specifically about some challenges and advances in neuroendocrine research. I have no disclosures. My objectives for today, I will discuss clinical trials and why they matter, specifically in rare cancer. I'll briefly discuss the life cycle of clinical trials, talk about some of the challenges faced both by patients as well as researchers when dealing with rare cancer, what the patient experience looks like and how we can improve upon that. And then I'll spend the last part of my talk talking about the neuroendocrine trials that we currently have within the rare cancer program here at LSU, just to try to bring some awareness to what is actually available here for your patients. So before we start discussing trials, I'll just give a very brief overview of neuroendocrine cancer. Neuroendocrine neoplasms are rare, but like other cancers, they are on the rise. In fact, we've seen a 5-fold increase in the past 5 decades. And this is partly due to better and improved detection and earlier detection. So neuroendocrine tumors are a heterogeneous group of neoplasms. They are located throughout the body in neuroendocrine cells, most commonly in the gastrointestinal tract, but they can also, in pancreas, but they can also occur in the thymus, the lung, and less commonly in ovaries, heart, and prostate. Well-differentiated nets strongly express somatostatin receptors, predominantly the SST2 subtype, and this is the actionable target for many of the therapies that are available to this patient population. Neuroendocrine patients present with what can be vague symptoms that include bowel changes and pain, diarrhea, flushing, fatigue, and these symptoms are often attributed to more benign conditions and as a result causes significant delay in diagnosis. In fact, I think it's on average about 5 years from the time that patients present with symptoms that they are correctly diagnosed. And as a result, 40 to 60% of patients that present with neuroendocrine have metastatic disease. So surgical resection with curative intent is the frontline treatment for localized NETs, whereas disease that's become metastatic requires systemic therapy and may also involve surgical interventions for symptomatic control. The systemic therapy includes your somatostatin analog, the both short-acting and long-acting. This is your octreotide, lanreotide, and some targeted agents, including sunitinib, everolimus, and the newly approved cabozantinib. Additionally, PRRT, lutetium-based PRRT, is a systemic therapy that is used when patients progress on somatostatin analogs. Despite these therapy options, there is a clear unmet need for additional therapies when patients progress. So why do clinical trials matter in the rare cancer space? These trials play an essential role in bringing access to emerging therapies for this patient population that wouldn't normally be available to them. Additionally, these trials bridge the gap in rare cancer biology. Compared to other cancers, there's significantly less investment in these types of cancers, and clinical trials can by bringing participants in, can accelerate discovery. Clinical trials can also enhance patient care in that they connect patients to specialized centers offering multidisciplinary support and advanced symptom management. Importantly, clinical trials are a very important mechanism to improving outreach and reduce disparities by ensuring diverse patient representation in research. And in an increasingly difficult healthcare coverage landscape, clinical trials offer treatment options to patients who may not have access to treatments, including standard of care. Okay, sorry about that. Clinical trials also generate the evidence base that drives standard of care, as well as policy and guidelines in this patient population. So just very briefly, I'll talk about the life cycle of a clinical trial for those of you who are not involved in these studies. In phase 1, these are done in a small patient population. They're focused primarily on safety and focusing on side effects. In phase 2, there's a larger patient population, and with the goal of determining initial effectiveness, as well as closely monitoring side effects that may develop. Phase 3 trials are large-scale trials. They usually involve multi-site cooperation. They are randomized and controlled to confirm effectiveness and compare against the standard treatments. And this is where a company would file for an NDA. In the event of a successful phase 3 trial, we would complete a phase 4 or post-marketing surveillance trial. The purpose is to determine long-term safety and efficacy and potentially guide in a real-world setting and potentially guide any labeling changes. So, which sounds simple enough, but only about 4% of oncology drugs that enter phase 1 actually receive FDA approval. So patients with rare cancers, such as NETs, experience some unique challenges, including limited public awareness and inconsistent provider experience with the disease, which often leads to a delay in diagnosis. Due to that, patients often enter the clinical trial landscape with a healthy dose of skepticism and confusion about their treatment options. NETs often require multidisciplinary management, including endocrinology, oncology, surgery, nuclear medicine, which is not always available within a local healthcare system and may require regional specialty centers. And this fragmentation can further complicate trial enrollment or participation. The high diagnostic and monitoring requirements, such as frequent imaging, lab assessments, and follow-up appointments, impose substantial physical, emotional, and financial burdens on these patients. So this is where the advocacy groups really help. These organizations can provide education, community support, and help navigate clinical trials effectively. Rare cancers also present unique challenges to researchers, primarily in the fact that there's a limited patient pool. The net rarity limits eligible participants, resulting in prolonged recruitment and need for multi-center collaboration. The tumor heterogeneity that we see with these tumors, which vary widely in grade and biology, complicate eligibility criteria and require complex stratified trial designs. And the geographic barriers that are true for patients are also true for researchers, in that specialty NET centers are limited geographically and create those travel and financial burdens to the patients. So how can we improve on the patient experience? First and foremost, reducing trial burden and improving logistics. We try to provide transportation support whenever possible. We negotiate with sponsors to pay for travel, to pay for lodging. We try to offer flexible scheduling and fewer in-person visits. Not always possible because these visits are dictated by the protocol, but you can negotiate with the sponsor to try to minimize some of the in-person visits and allow some of the assessments to be done locally. We also try to complete multiple procedures during in-person visits. So if we're screening a patient for a trial, we try to do all of the screening assessments in one day to limit how many times they need to visit the clinic. Expanding digital and decentralized options, use of mobile apps for scheduling reminders and information, implement telehealth visit and remote monitoring, again, when possible, and the use of electronic diaries to record patient-reported outcomes. We also have to be very sensitive to the fact that clinical trials have a checkered past with certain demographics. There have certainly been abuses with clinical trials, and we have to be sensitive to that and be aware that some people are entering these trials with a lot of fear and hesitation. We try to provide plain language study material, Again, financial support whenever possible, and partner with community outreach groups for recruitment and education. Because we recognize that access to clinical trials is a very important mechanism to decrease healthcare disparities, which ultimately can lead to better health outcomes. So for the last part of my talk, I'll talk about the clinical trial portfolio that we have at LSU. Again, just to kind of bring awareness to the trials that are available right here in your backyard. In the phase 1, we have, oops, this is so sensitive. Okay, won't touch it. In phase 1, we have the Bravest study. This is a dose escalation, dose expansion, first in human study, assessing the safety of CRN09682, which is a non-peptide conjugate of an SSTR2 binding non-protein to a cytotoxic agent. And we affectionately call it the cytotoxic bomb. This study is, it's, God blessed. This study is currently open to enrollment. In phase 2, we have the AlphaMedix phase 2 study. This was a study testing the efficacy and safety of PB212 dotamtate, and this was a first-in-class targeted alpha therapy tested in the neuroendocrine patient population, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in this slide. The paltusotine phase 2 study, this is sponsored by also sponsored by Crinetics, looking at, so paltusotine is a first-in-class non-peptide selective SST2 agonist being tested in adults to treat carcinoid syndrome. This study has met primary and secondary endpoints and has progressed to a phase 3 study, which we also have open at LSU. In the phase 3 space, we have the Sorrento study. This is a study sponsored by Camurus. CAM 2029 was being compared to long-acting octreotide or lanreotide. CAM 2029 is a proprietary formulation of octreotide, which allows it to be delivered in what's essentially an EpiPen style syringe and allows patients to self-administer the octreotide versus having to visit an infusion clinic, which is very burdensome for patients who've been getting shots for 20 years. The Action 1 study sponsored by Raise Bio is looking at RIS-101, which is another, it's another alpha emitter using actinium-225 versus standard of care. We have patients in this study, but it's no longer open to enrollment. So as I said, the paltusotine has moved on to a phase 3 study called CareFinder. This study includes a randomized, placebo-controlled, blinded period, but also includes a crossover period that allows any patients who may have received placebo in the blinded portion to cross over and receive the study drug. The NETA-3 trial by Novartis is looking at the safety and efficacy of lutetium dotatate in newly diagnosed neuroendocrine patients who have grade 1 and 2. So normally you would not use PRRT until patients have progressed on an SSA, on the somatostatin analog. In this study, we're using it as a frontline therapy. So any newly diagnosed patient that you may have, instead of starting them on lanreotide, please consider this trial. The Stellar 311 study by Exelixis is looking at the safety and efficacy of zanzalintinib. Zanzalintinib is the next generation tyrosine kinase inhibitor. It is basically meant to replace cabozantinib. It has the same targets as cabozantinib, but a shorter half-life and should have a better side effect profile. So again, the green studies are open to enrollment. So if anything sounds like something that might be a fit for a patient that crosses your path, let us know. On the horizon, we have the VMT AlphaNet phase 1/2 study by Perspective Pharmaceuticals. I'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide. In phase 2, we have NET Retreat, which is an NCI trial, which will retreat patients with 2 doses of Lutathera following completed 4 cycles of PRRT. And phase 3, the Oranomed Alphamedics phase 3 study, which was meant to compare PB212 dotamtate directly versus Lutathera. This study is on hold currently, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the Alphamedics phase 2 study, the sponsor has released some of the information, has published the information on the results of that study. So PB212 dotamtate, again, this is an alpha emitter versus a beta emitter, which is lutetium. And just as a quick reminder, alpha particles have a much shorter path length, and so they should cause less collateral damage. And they also have a much higher linear energy transfer, which causes double-stranded breaks, DNA breaks, that are much harder for the cells to repair. So it should increase the therapeutic effectiveness of this therapy. So the Alphamedics phase 2 trial looked at 2 cohorts of patients. They looked at PRRT naive patients, as well as patients who had previously been treated with PRRT, and reported both investigator assessments and blinded independent central review assessment. The study had a very impressive overall response rate of anywhere between 57 and 60%, just kind of depending on if it's central review or investigator. And a progression-free survival rate at 36 months of anywhere between 72% and 83%, and a 36-month overall survival rate of 88.22%. In the previously treated cohort, the overall response rate was reported at anywhere from 19% to 34%. While progression-free survival at 18 months was reported at 82 to 88%, with an 18-month overall survival rate of 85%. The adverse events that were reported for this study included some side effects that were expected and mild, including alopecia, nausea, fatigue, as well as lymphopenia, which was severe in some cases. There were some grade 3 and 4. However, they were described as not clinically significant by the investigator. However, there were some long-term side effects that were more severe, including renal insufficiency, in some cases severe, grade 3 and 4, in about 17% of the naive cohort. 6 of these patients did develop chronic kidney disease and eventually developed kidney failure. Another unexpected adverse event was dysphagia, which was variable in severity, but can require intervention, including Botox injections or surgery, and does affect approximately 50% of the patients. It's a very common side effect that we see with this therapy, including 2 cases of aspiration pneumonia. So given the impressive objective response, but the serious concerns about renal toxicity, several companies are trying to develop alpha particle-based radioligand therapies that will improve renal clearance. The goal is to reduce uptake and retention of radiolabeled peptides in the proximal renal tubule cells and decrease the risk of radiation-induced nephropathy. So this is the study I mentioned earlier, sponsored by Perspective Pharmaceuticals. They are looking at a compound called PB212 VMT alpha-NET. And this compound has a proprietary chelator, which has a neutral charge. So in contrast to DOTA, which is used in the previous radioligand therapies, which has a positive charge, this one is neutral and should reduce the electrostatic interactions of the renal tubule cells and reduce uptake. This study will include GEP nets, bronchial nets, PHEOs, paraganglioma, and meningioma, and will include dosimetry studies to carefully monitor renal absorbed dose. So Raise Bio also has a radiopharmaceutical agent that they've developed called RIS SSA that they'll be testing in the RIS 401 phase 1 study.
Okay. So again, we're looking at improved renal clearance and lower renal and dose. Um, this study does not plan an aminoacid confusion, which is very new to this class of therapies. Um, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is for reduced retention, but preclinical studies of cloud distribution in xenograft models did show a very favorable tumor to kidney ratio, indicating far less kidney retention. So these are both fronts that everyone is very excited about because, again, the effectiveness of the alpha emitter seems to be very impressive, superior to beta emitters, but there's a serious risk of renal toxicity with these agents. We have some real barriers that we need to deal with when conducting clinical trials, especially in the rare cancer space. Access to trials continues to be a major hurdle for patient participation, operational complexity, as well as representative inequalities, and of course the financial toxicity. These live a long time and they incur 10, 20, 30 years of huge medical bills. And we really need to be very cognizant of that and try to reduce that financial toxicity for these patients. So, but how do clinical trials do offer an opportunity to decrease healthcare disparities by giving access to not only cutting edge therapies, but also standard of care therapy to patients who may not otherwise
Be able to access them. Patients who are underinsured, uninsured, have no access to any of these therapies. And so we continue to build our trial portfolio. We want to give as many options to patients as possible when they walk in that door, especially in that ever increasing difficult landscape of insurance coverage. And we continue to partner with medical centers, sponsors, and advocacy groups to make these trials as feasible for patients as they possibly can be. And then before that music comes on, I just want to thank our incredible group. Dr. Maluccio is our medical director, Dr. Boudreau, Dr. Ram, as well as our clinical staff and nurses, Jenny, Terry, Marlene, Casey. Without them, our clinic would implode in exactly 45 minutes. And I also like to thank the LSU Cancer Center who provide coordinator research support. And the coordinators, as you know, are the backbone of these clinical trials. So thank you to them. And of course, our patients, we couldn't do this without them. And then thank you for listening and not running away with that music.